So going back to mechanisms, we know that attention is a very limited resource. Also, we know that attention is not a single thing, but rather has many different components and sub-processes. And here I'd like to bring your attention to 3 specific components of attention. Alerting, meaning here sustained vigilance to an object. So in the context of meditation, this could be maintaining one's attentional focus on the breath, or maintaining one's attentional focus on physical sensation during the body scan. Another aspect of attention is this reorienting, intentionally switching our attentional focus. It could either be in the presence of a spatial cue where we shift our attention, or it can be internally driven where we shift our attention once I realize that my mind is distracted, I bring it back to the object of meditation. Third aspect is executive or cognitive control of attention, involving selective attention, where inhibition of things that are task irrelevant and selectively focusing on that which is important, like the object of meditation. So, for example, noticing thoughts as they arise, but maintaining my attention on the breath and actively inhibiting letting my mind run to thinking. Fortunately, wonderful work by Jin Fan, Michael Posner, and others have begun to identify the neural substrates, distributed sets of brain responses that together form the substrate in which these different aspects of attention, alerting, orienting, executive control, are instantiated. So we can literally begin to see, well, does this set of brain regions fire together more so after a mindfulness meditation or other types of attention training? What we see here is in 15 adult social phobics, brain imaging results from pre to post mindfulness training for this task of shifting attention to the breath in the presence of a negative self-belief. And what we see in blue, red, and yellow are activations that are greater post-mindfulness training in this group during attentional regulation, meaning that these are nodes that have already been identified in this attention network by Jin Fan and Michael Posner. So this is some preliminary data indicating that mindfulness meditation does cause increased activity in the distributed set of brain regions associated with attention regulation, attention control. And now we use this as a basis for getting a grant, and now we're looking at this in 60 adults who are going through mindfulness training. Looking at this in a little more detail, what you see in the upper left is bilateral dorsal amygdala activity that was derived from spinning on negative self-beliefs, idiosyncratic negative self-beliefs. And we see that in healthy controls, there's a little bit of reactivity, and then from left to right, from spinning on negative beliefs to implementing attention regulation, you see that at the end of that block, the amygdala signal tends to go down in healthy controls. At baseline, pre-mindfulness training, the black line, social phobics, you see that there's a delay and then there's a ramping up of activity in the right dorsal amygdala when spinning on negative beliefs. But when attention is directed towards focusing on the breath, you see that there's a gradual reduction. Shown here, the same set of social phobics, pre-black line and post-orange line, mindfulness training. And there are a couple of things that I'd like to point out. First, interestingly, in the orange line there, the first circle, during spinning on negative beliefs, there's actually an increase, an earlier onset of amygdala activity. One possible explanation for this is that mindfulness leads to greater emotional awareness, meaning greater initial reactivity, because one is more in tune and aware of and not avoiding emotional experience and emotional cues. The second circle indicates a very rapid reduction in this right dorsal amygdala in social phobics post-mindfulness. This is pre-instruction to shift attention to the breath. One way to interpret this is that what was initially effortful, cued attentional shifting has become ingrained and has been incorporated as a very rapid automatic process for dealing with emotional stimulation. So that what was initially a learned, effortful practice has now become instantiated as a very rapid automatic response. And then thirdly, that when the cue to shift attention comes on, this disrupts the current attentional focus, and then you have to refocus now onto the breath. And that again, the attention regulation helps to attenuate some of this amygdala-based emotion signal. I also mentioned that self-view might be one of the mechanisms. There's now great interest in trying to bring neuroscientific tools to understanding not a seat for the self in the brain, but how different ways of viewing or relating to oneself might lead to different patterns of neural activity. But first, there are different forms of self-processing. So one form that's been looked at is analytic or narrative self, which is more of a past, future-oriented sense of self. It's a fixed self-concept and really associated with rumination. Another aspect is the experiential self, present moment focused, continuously changing experience of self as a transient, impermanent phenomena. And then this has been associated with reduced, overgeneralized memory, which is related to depression and anxiety. We used a self-focused or self-referential encoding task in the scanner with healthy controls and social phobics. And there's a very strong midline or mid-sagittal midline set of brain regions that become active. Medial prefrontal cortex, dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, and the posterior cingulate. These are three specific regions that across meta-analyses seem to be associated with self-focused attention. And here we see that this is clearly the case both in our controls and in the social phobics. After mindfulness training, what we have found is that there is a reduction in the neural bases of the analytic or narrative or conceptual perception of self. Specifically, we found in the social phobics, 15 adults, post-mindfulness compared to pre, we found, in this case blue, indicating reduced neural activity. Reduced activity in the left ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, an area associated with linguistic processing. Reduction in this dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, perhaps again this reduction in this conceptual appraisal or conceptual notion of self. And then in the medial PFC, again a reduction in self-focused or self-referential processing. We found increases only in precuneus and superior parietal lobule, indicating greater visual attention, meaning that more direct visual processing can happen in the context of reduced linguistic and cognitive processing. So this is some preliminary evidence that we're looking at furthermore in 60 adults with social phobia, how the mindfulness influences both positive and negative views of self. In summary, I hope I've shown you that in the context of a threat stimulus, specific brain systems in the limbic, paralimbic system are reduced, emotional reactivity is reduced by practicing mindfulness or training in mindfulness, and that there's an increase in the ability to use cognitive regulation, self-talk, as well as attention regulation. And that neural substrates that support conceptual senses of self and linguistic processing are decreased with mindfulness training. So in summary, meditation is associated with changes in the neural bases of attention regulation of emotion and shifting from conceptual to a more experiential sense of self. And that perhaps might be greater neural synchrony of brain systems post-mindfulness, but this obviously requires further research. And I thank you very, very much for your attention. And please do feel free to contact me via email, and I'm happy to answer any and all questions.